Papa returned home after many years away, and when he welcomed his children, he couldn't hold back the tears. When he returned, no one knew what would come of it. His appearance was like a thunderclap, eclipsing the usual cares and rhythms. He wasn't a bad man, but his long years of absence had left marks. And now, as he stood at the door, no one knew how to feel. There was no joy or anger, only uncertainty. Alexei. It was a name he'd heard so rarely, but one that had been a part of his life for so long. Alexei, the father who had come home after so many years. Not just back, but right now. And in this moment, there were more questions than answers. He didn't know what to expect from his children. He had long thought that he could turn back the clock, could make up for those years of absence, but here they were at the door. The children, grown children, the ones who had once been little, now carrying the weight of the past on their faces. Those who knew him but didn't remember. He himself was not ready. And now what? And they didn't know what to do either. Should they go back to the way things were? Recognize? Forgive? Ask for forgiveness? Say all that was not said, or remain silent? Silence here wasn't just silence. It was a decision that continued to be part of their relationship. Vladimir and Anna, his children, looked at him curiously, but without the genuine love he expected to see. They had grown up, accustomed to being without him, and maybe even found some new meaning in this life, but something important was missing. Something he could give if he were there. And yet, there was some detachment in their gaze. So Alexei, Victor, the eldest son, said, and wiped his hair with the palm of his hand, "Have you thought of something for us? What are we going to talk about now?" I hadn't expected such directness, but there it was. No shyness, no good daddy game. It wasn't even an accusation, it was a question. He didn't know how to answer it. 3 years. 3 long years, and here they were back together. But no one was sure what that meant. Apologize for those years? Or try to just start fresh? Alexei would have liked to answer, but the words somehow didn't seem to add up. "You haven't written in a long time," Anna, his youngest daughter, said. But there was no reproach in her voice. It was something else. Something important. A tone as if she were simply stating a fact. As if her life had been going on without him for a long time. She had grown up. And he'd seen her world built without his input. And it was a different world. A world where he wasn't needed, wasn't important. She looked at him, but she didn't smile, didn't show joy at his return. But neither did she reject him. Just observed. As if trying to figure out what was even going on. And he remembered everything. He remembered how small she had been, how she had sat on his shoulders, how her laughter had laughed. But it had all been a long time ago. A long time ago. And now, after all these years, he was returning to this world that had changed, and with it them, his children. "You didn't expect things to be like they were, did you?" Victor again. He'd always been so straightforward. Yes, they were all different. But when Victor said those words, there was not only truth in them, but also an undercurrent of pain. He, as the eldest, didn't expect his father's help. He didn't expect anything from him. Because over the years he had learned to be himself, to be an adult, to be independent. Would things really go back to the old way now? Alexei felt his heart clench at those words. They were the right ones. He had left. And he didn't know how to regain their trust. "You know, Dad," Victor said, "I don't understand why you came back at all. We learned to live without you. It's okay. Sometimes it seems like you coming back is just going to make things harder." Silence hung in the room. Alexei knew it wasn't anger, but something more complicated. It was an absence of feeling. Just an emptiness that made him ache. He looked at the children, at their faces, and realized they weren't the same anymore. And he had changed, too. "You didn't know what you'd lost?" Anna asked, though her words sounded more like a question to herself. She didn't expect him to answer. She didn't even expect him to explain. She was just looking for a response within herself to figure out how this was all going to work out now. She's an adult, she can accept anything. But she didn't expect it to be this hard to do so. Her words hung in the air like threads that could be broken but didn't want to. After all, this was a moment when none of them knew exactly what it would take to get back to what they had all once known. But what if that return didn't happen at all? What if their whole life was like this now? With secrets, with unspoken words, with unanswered questions. Alexei felt it, and everyone felt it. Being at home doesn't mean you get your love back. Being close doesn't mean becoming part of a world that has long existed without you. At some point, he felt like an observer, like in a movie. He was not part of this picture. He was its shadow. Alexei waited. He couldn't say anything. Just stood in the doorway and watched. And that moment was so much harder than all the years he had lost. And then silence. and there was more pain in that silence than in any words. It had been several days since Alexei had returned. He tried to find the words to make things right, but the words never came. No gifts, no apologies could bring back that lost moment, those years when he wasn't around. He had brought the children toys, clothes, little things that once, maybe, would have seemed important to them. But now, in their eyes, they were just things, like subtle attempts to hide the gulf that had formed between them over so many years. Anna didn't say a word when he placed in front of her a bag of expensive earrings he thought she would like. She took them in her hands, looked at them, but never put them on. She just put them back on the table, as if she didn't know what to do with them. Alexei caught that look. She didn't blame him, but she didn't accept it either. She had become silent and aloof. Her coldness was like a blow to him. After all, he remembered that girl who had gladly taken everything he brought her, but now she was like he didn't know her. He realized he couldn't just take back that moment when she looked at him with unconditional love. Vladimir was more straightforward. He was always like that. He didn't like to hide his emotions, even when it was disadvantageous. He didn't speak directly, but his actions, his words had everything: dissatisfaction, resentment, aloofness. When Alexei tried to talk to him, offering to throw money at the project he was working on, he didn't even respond. He just waved it away. And silence again. He turned his back and walked away as if he wasn't even there. "Did you bring our things?" Anna asked, finally breaking the silence, but her voice was as hollow as an old dress. "Did you think it would bring us back?" Alexei tried to explain again, but the words wouldn't come. Not because there weren't any, but because they couldn't express what was in his soul. He wanted to say that he had realized everything, that he was ready to redeem himself, that he regretted the past, that he wanted to start over. But instead, the only question that remained on his lips was, "What do you want from me, children? When will he realize that everything only goes backwards after time? Or is it already too late?" Meanwhile, Vladimir and Anna remained silent. Anna sat across from him, her gaze focused on something of her own, as if she hadn't heard him. But there was something more in Vladimir's eyes. It was a disappointment that would have made Alexei drown. He realized that he couldn't take back the years, couldn't erase them from the face of time. He was ready for a lot of things, but not this. Not for a moment when his children, who had grown up in his absence, didn't expect him back, but rather just expected something completely different. They weren't kids asking Daddy to come back. They were adults with their own lives, their own plans, their own experiences. And for them, his return was more of an unpleasant reminder of what they hadn't gotten over. Resentments that wouldn't let go. Fears that never found an outlet. There wasn't a single fight, not a single word that could have been the cause of this tension. It just hung in the air, electrified by the unspoken. It was as if everyone realized that everything that was happening now made no sense. Because time can't go back. And this whole situation was only reinforcing the fact that their world would never be the same. Alexei felt like a stranger in this house. Even if his children tried to be polite, even if they didn't say anything out loud, everything was clear without words. One night, sitting down to dinner, he felt his seat become strange. He tried to say something, to suggest something, but no one supported his conversation. Only scrappy phrases that didn't lead to dialogue. Everything was following a familiar trajectory. He was behaving like an old acquaintance who hadn't realized that he hadn't been expected for a long time. "Don't you think that you are pulling yourself into this web?" Victor said without raising his eyes. It was like a blow, not from anger, but from pain. He didn't know what to say to that. He didn't know how to find words that didn't sound like an attempt to justify himself. "I wanted it all back," Alexei said, but I'm not sure he believed it himself. "I just wanted things to go back to the way they were." Victor looked at him, but not with the reproachful look that children usually give their parents when they make excuses. No, it was the look of an adult who wasn't asking for an explanation, but rather trying to figure out what might come of all this. He didn't say anything, and that silence was worse than any accusation. The next morning, Olga, Alexei's sister, who had always been a person of many opinions, intervened in the conversation. She came to their home, took the children's side, but did not condemn. Olga was of the opinion that he didn't deserve forgiveness, and she openly expressed that. It was uncomfortable for everyone, but there was more truth in her words than they wanted to admit. "You can't just go back and think everyone will forget you left them," she said, as if offering some moral truth that the kids hadn't realized. "They're grown up, and you have to realize that they can now live without you. You can't become part of their lives for nothing." Alexei tried to object, but he couldn't answer anything. After all, He himself knew that there was no going back. He looked for excuses for himself, and they were not accepted. He looked at his children, and in their eyes he did not see what he had been searching for so long. He didn't see frustration or anger. There was just emptiness there. The silence that was in their home grew louder and louder. This whole situation was like a movie where each character was trying to figure out what to do next, but didn't know what to say. It had been several days since Alexei had returned home, and the tension in the air had become unbearable. Words were failing. Anything he could say to his children seemed too small to make up for the gap between them in any way. There was no joy, no anger, only alienation, which they held back like a heavy burden. But at last the moment came when they could no longer remain silent. They had gathered around the table that evening, and despite all attempts to talk themselves out of it, the silence had become too loud. Alexei knew that this moment had come. Something had to be said, to cut through this strained fog, but what? He knew it would be nearly impossible to return to their lives, but he still hoped for some kind of miracle, for that connection that had once existed. But nothing of the sort was happening. Anna, sitting across from him, finally spoke, and her words cut through the silence like a knife. "Do you really think you can just go back and everything will be like before?" She asked, her voice as dry as sand. "You disappeared for years, and now you're hoping you'll just bring us some toys and everything will be normal?" Alexei felt his chest tighten. It wasn't aggression. It was hopeless desperation. She was right, of course. He knew himself that he couldn't get back what he had. But the words that had been holding back in his chest didn't want to come out. He tried to find some excuse for himself, but it all seemed empty. I didn't know what to do." He stood up, averting his gaze, not knowing what to say. "I was desperate, and I didn't know how to help you. I thought I would leave you alone so you wouldn't suffer. But I was wrong." But Anna didn't look impressed. She just shook her head silently, as if realizing that none of this mattered. "Were you desperate?" Her voice was quieter now, but no less strong. "Were we? Weren't we desperate? You were preoccupied with yourself, and we were without you. You don't know what it was like, to have everything fall apart, and you just disappear. It's unforgivable." Alexei looked at her, and his heart sank. Yes, he knew what she'd been through, that she'd matured over the years. But he couldn't fully understand exactly how it all felt, how it was for her. Vladimir, sitting next to her, suddenly stood up and gestured toward the door. "You want us to forgive you, don't you?" His voice was as cold as ice. "But for what? What is there to forgive? You weren't with us, you left. You abandoned us. We grew up without you, without your help. What makes you think you can go back and start over?" Alexei sighed and sat back down, but there was no pain or anger in his eyes. It was more of a heaviness, the heaviness of admitting that the kids were right. He had abandoned them. He had walked away, and now they were strangers. Even if he wanted to fix it, he didn't know how. "I didn't know what to do." His voice was almost a whisper now. "But I always thought I'd come back, that I'd be back in time. I didn't know things would be different for you, and that you would be so different. I tried to find a way to get it all back, but I lost you, and now I can't find my way back." Anna looked up at him. There were more questions than answers in her eyes. But she didn't say anything. Instead, she stood up and silently left the room. Vladimir stood up too, without saying a word, and followed her. Only Alexei remained, alone in the empty room. He could have made excuses, but he knew it was pointless. All he could do was stare at the door behind which his children had disappeared. The moral dilemma was clear. Could they forgive him? Should they forgive him for the years of silence and absence? If the reason for his disappearance was more than just a desire to leave, how should he explain it to them? How to bring back all that had been lost? He tried to justify himself in his thoughts, but realized it wouldn't help. He knew his children were right. He had left, and now they were adults with their own lives, their own pain, their own secrets, and their world wasn't the same now. They weren't waiting for him to come back. They weren't waiting for him to show up and change everything. That was the question that plagued him the most. Can you ever get something back when you've already lost it forever? Can you undo the years you weren't there for it? But at that moment outside voices intervened. Olga, his sister, came up to him after the children had gone to their rooms. She was the person who always interfered in the family's affairs, but this time her words were not as usual. "You don't understand, Alexei," she began, lowering her voice. "You think you'll come back, apologize, and everything will be fine. But you didn't know what happens to children when they lose their father. They grew up without you, and frankly, they're not sure you can be trusted." Alexei closed his eyes, as if trying to shake off those words. But Olga didn't stop. "Do you know what they want you to do? For you to leave. For you to leave them alone. Yes, they'll tell you it's okay, that they'll forgive you, but the truth is they're much better off without you. You don't see it, but I do. I know what they went through when you were gone. He didn't say a word. It was all true. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for his children to be adults, and for his place in their lives to be nothing more than that of a ghost. A few more days passed. Alexei was in the house, but everyone felt that he still remained at a distance. The barrier that stood between him and the children seemed insurmountable. Gifts, explanations, apologies, nothing helped. Even his own sister, Olga, who always intervened, noticed that he had become even more silent, immersed in himself. He didn't know how to get out of this situation. He had kept everything inside for so long that now that he was back, he didn't know where to start. The truth he'd been hiding was hard. Very hard. And now that everyone was expecting him to explain, he realized he had to finally tell everything. One evening, after the children had gone to their rooms again, and Alexei was alone in the kitchen, he met Olga's gaze. She was sitting at the table as before, but today her face was different, some tense, serious. She didn't ask him what was going on. She already knew, and he realized he couldn't stay silent any longer. Tell me the truth, Alexei. Her voice was quiet but firm. Why did you leave? Why did you just disappear? You weren't a bad father. You were a good one. Why didn't you come back when we needed you so much? Alexei felt his chest constrict. He took a deep breath, staring into the emptiness in front of him. He couldn't procrastinate any longer. He knew that if he didn't tell now, it would stay with him forever. What if the children found out the truth years later? How would they react? He had always dreaded this moment, but there was no turning back now. Do you want to know why I left? Alexei finally said the words, feeling them come hard out of his mouth. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to. I was trying to protect you. Olga stiffened, her eyes widening, and then she sat back down abruptly. Alexei, seeing her reaction, knew he could no longer back down. There was more than just a desire to leave, he continued, his voice trembling. There was more than just a disagreement with you. It was more complicated than that. Olga watched him carefully, not trying to interrupt. She knew that these were not just words, but something that could change everything. Alexei knew that if he told the truth now, he would destroy all the remaining bridges. But it was impossible to remain silent. Remember those strange people you were talking about? The ones who used to come to my work. I never told you what was really going on. You think I just walked out? No. They made threats. They wanted to find me. And not just me. They wanted your children. My children. Olga sat in silence. She couldn't believe it. Everything he was talking about was so unexpected and scary that she felt lost. Who are they, Alexei? Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you tell us? Because I couldn't. They said that if I told, they would do things to you that I couldn't even imagine. I wasn't alone. I knew if I did, I wouldn't protect you. I had to disappear to protect you all. Alexei sighed with difficulty. Those words were painful to him, like a knife in his heart. But he knew that if he didn't speak, he would lose even more. He looked at his sister, but saw in her eyes not only shock, but also something else, something like bewilderment and doubt. So you left to protect us? You were running away from them? Her voice was cold. And you didn't tell us? I couldn't. You don't understand, Alya. If I had told you, they would have come after you. They would have found you and done whatever they wanted. Her eyes were full of questions now, but there was also a realization in them that this story had some incredible depth to it. He couldn't just walk away and not explain. But why had kept silent? Why had he left the children in such ignorance? They both fell silent, and the silence in the room became more palpable. Alexei felt that heaviness that had been constricting him almost dissolve. But he also knew that those words couldn't fix everything. Because no matter how much he said, this secret was buried so deeply that there was no way to get something back in their relationship. You didn't know anything when you kept quiet, Olga said. You thought you were doing it for us, but really, you were just afraid. I was afraid. Alexei nodded. But I didn't know what would happen if I told you. I didn't know what would happen if they realized I'd told. I couldn't risk you. But now that he'd told everything, Alexei didn't feel relieved. He felt an emptiness. He realized that he may have lost something he couldn't get back. Meanwhile, the children sensed that something was wrong. When they found out that such things were being discussed in the house, they couldn't stay away. But what would they do now with this truth? What would happen to them now when they found out what was really going on? They thought there was just some sort of personal breakup, but now that the truth was out, they didn't know how to react to it. A few hours later, as Alexei sat in his room, his children came up to him. They stood at the door and looked at him. He felt that this moment would be decisive. "You told us the truth," Vladimir said. His voice was firm, but there was an inner struggle in it. "But now I don't know what to do about it." Anna stood beside him, her face closed, her gaze impenetrable. "Why didn't you tell us before? Why didn't you explain it to us when we were children?" she asked. "I didn't know what to do," Alexei answered quietly. "I thought it was better. I thought I couldn't risk your safety." They stood in silence, each of them feeling this truth turning their lives upside down. The question that still hung in the air was obvious. Who could be trusted now? Who knew the truth and was hiding it? After Alexei told his terrible secret, the world of his children, which seemed so familiar and understandable, suddenly became shaky. Everything they knew about their father was threatened, and now, after years of silence, each of them was on the verge of psychological transformation. From the moment the truth came out, everything changed. And while they didn't know what to make of this information, it had already begun to shatter their previous perceptions of the world. Anna was the first to feel this change. She sat in the corner of her room, not knowing what to do with herself. Everything she had thought about her father came into question. Before this, she had perceived him as someone who had simply decided to leave. She had seen his detachment and absence from their lives as a personal tragedy, but nothing more than that. However, now that she knew the truth, now that it was clear to her that her father hadn't just disappeared, but had been forced into hiding for their safety, her perception had changed, but she didn't know what to do about it. Her father's words echoed in her head. He had been forced to leave for their protection? She couldn't believe it. She just couldn't imagine that her life could have been in danger, that her father was being pursued by some men. Anna couldn't help her frustration and anger. Why hadn't he told them this before? Why did they have to live all these years without knowing the truth? Anna had always been a closed person who didn't like to open up, but now her inner world had become even more closed. On the one hand, she was relieved that her father was not a bad man, but on the other, she felt anger. He had been there for her, and he could have told her for once what was going on, what had led to his disappearance. Why was it easier for him to keep quiet than to open up to his children? Her eyes were a mixture of everything: bitterness, disappointment, distrust. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life had been switched, that her family had never been real because her father had hidden such a huge truth. He thought he was protecting them that way, but now it seemed to her that it was his silence that hurt her the most. Vladimir, the eldest son, had been more open than his sister, but his reaction to the secret revealed was no less complicated. He knew his father was leaving, but he thought it was due to family problems. He didn't believe the reason was so dire as to leave them without help, without support. After he learned the truth, his perception of his father changed, but not like Anna's. Vladimir found himself doubly confused. He still felt his resentment for the years his father hadn't been around. But now, with the new information, he didn't know how to react to it all anymore. He was upset that his father hadn't told them about his situation, but at the same time, he couldn't help but admire the way he had handled the danger while protecting them. He spent more time alone with himself, reflecting on his life, how his family was set up, and how his entire reality had changed in an instant. Vladimir didn't know what to do with this new information. It simultaneously gave him an opportunity to vindicate his father and left him with a deep wound. He was still worried about his father's disappearance, and his efforts to return could not immediately absorb the pain he had experienced during his years of loneliness. However, Vladimir became more open with people with whom he had not previously shared his experiences. He could no longer remain withdrawn. Changes began to take place in his life. He began to open up about his feelings and realize how much he needed support. But deep down, he still couldn't forget that the person he had waited for and needed so much as a child wasn't there for him. Anna, on the contrary, became even more closed than before. She didn't want to talk to anyone, couldn't share her thoughts with those around her. For her, her father was like a man who had disappeared in their lives, and now that image had disintegrated even further. Her inner struggle between her desire to forgive and her inability to accept his actions continued. When Alexei noticed that his children were beginning to change, he didn't know how to deal with it. He felt that his efforts to repair the relationship were failing. Every move he made was received differently. In his attempts to connect with them, in his attempts to be there for them, he kept feeling the distance growing between them. He saw Anna turn away, shut down, and it deepened his guilt even more. He saw Vladimir trying to be open, but every time they tried to talk, he felt that their conversations were going nowhere. His father thought he could regain his trust, but realized it was much harder than he had imagined. However, it was at this point, when all seemed lost, that a subtle moment of understanding began to emerge in the relationship between him and the children. Alexei began to realize that his efforts should not be directed at returning the old relationship, but at building a new one. And this realization was painful, because he still hoped that he could get back everything that had been lost. But the children had changed, they had become adults, and now, to reconnect with them, he needed to act differently. Anna, though she remained closed off, was beginning to show that she was willing to trust after all. She was no longer the girl who loved her father unconditionally. She was becoming more mature, realizing that the world was not as simple as she thought it was. She began to realize that her father wasn't just a father. He was a man who, like everyone else, made mistakes. And she now stood at the crossroads of her emotions. On the one hand, she wanted to forgive him. On the other, she couldn't forget how many years she had lived without him. Vladimir, for his part, began to look more understandingly at his father. He still felt the pain, but he was beginning to realize that what had happened was not so simple. He became more tolerant, and even if he couldn't completely forgive his father, he no longer judged him for everything that had happened. The kinship began to change. It wasn't instantaneous, but there were hints that they were gradually beginning to understand each other. It was painful and difficult, but there was something reassuring about the process. The psychological transformation of the children was not quick, but it was inevitable. Several months had passed since Alexei had revealed the truth. Their lives had begun to change, but the changes were difficult, painful, and sometimes hard to accept. The family, which had once been a strong whole, was now broken into pieces, each of which had to be reassembled. But despite all the doubts and worries, the growing resentments and mistrust, there came a moment when each of them could see something new in this process of recovery. Each in his own way came to the realization that everything was not so simple, but there was still a chance to start over. Alexei felt it. He was no longer hoping for quick changes, no longer expecting things to get better right away. He realized that his children were wounded, and that the time that had passed could not be made up for in any words. But the moment he tried to take a step towards his children, he realized that not all was lost. He could at least try. And with that step, he opened the door to forgiveness. He was willing to accept everything, the hurt, the silence, the resentment. He knew he couldn't get back the lost years, but he was willing to do whatever it took to regain even a modicum of trust. To do so, he was willing to go through the pain, the realization that forgiving and being forgiven was a difficult and painful process. But it may have been the only way to feel part of this family again. The children, though not ready to let go of their resentments completely, began to change slowly. Anna, who had taken a long time to recover from her father's revelations, finally sat down to talk to him. She had been silent, thoughtful, but now, as she looked at him, she realized that she saw before her not just the man who had disappeared, but a man with real experiences, with real mistakes. "Did you really think it would be easy?" she asked, sitting across from him. "You left, and we lived without you, thinking you just didn't want to be around. But you left for a different reason, and I can't understand it right away." Alexei listened to her carefully. He knew her words were full of pain, but he understood. This was the first step. A step that opened the door for them both to talk, to reconnect at least partially. He was silent, but there was everything in his eyes: regret, the realization that they had to go on, despite everything. "I understand," he said quietly. "I understand how hard it was. And if I could go back, I'd probably do things differently. But now the only thing I can do is try to be there for you. I know a lot is lost, but if you're ready, I'll be there for you." Anna was silent, but there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't the same look from a few months ago. It was softer, though not full of forgiveness. But at least she recognized that her father wasn't just someone who had disappeared. She realized that he had his own reasons, his own worries. Vladimir, with whom Alexei hadn't found a way to communicate either, had finally decided to talk. He was the one who went through the hardest moments. He was the one who was always silent and didn't show what hurt him. But now, as he looked at his father, he couldn't help but recognize that his life was not only about pain and loss, but also about forgiveness. He realized that he couldn't just stay silent and not try to change things. But he needed time to figure out how to take action. One day, sitting at dinner, Vladimir suddenly turned to his father. "You know, I've been thinking for a long time," he said. "I thought you had just left, that you didn't want to be with us. But now I realize you had your reasons. You wanted to protect us. And I'm starting to realize that sometimes there are times when people have to make hard choices. And maybe I'm not ready to forgive you completely, but I can't say that I hate you." Alexei felt the weight on his heart let go a little. Those words, though not a full forgiveness, were a big step. He knew that Vladimir hadn't forgotten the years he hadn't been around, and wouldn't be able to just forgive everything. But this moment was important. It was the moment they began to see each other in a new way. It was the beginning of a new phase. It was important to Alexei that they started to open up. He knew that this was the only way to build a new relationship. One step at a time. But it was enough for him. Not immediately, but the spark that had been lost before appeared between them. They began to talk gradually, piece by piece, rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, but hope began to ripen in their hearts. Hope that one day they would be able to forgive each other, that they would be able to start over. The final scene that defined their entire lives to that point occurred a few months later when the family gathered around the dinner table. It wasn't a solemn occasion. It was an ordinary day, but for Alexei and his children it became special. They were all sitting around the table, and despite the silence, something important was in the air. Anna, Vladimir, and Alexei were sitting together, but now each felt that there was something more than just resentment between them. There was something important, an understanding that life doesn't always give you a second chance, but if you get one, you have to use it. And despite everything they had been through, they were now ready for a new beginning. "I don't know how things will go," Vladimir said, looking up at his father. "But maybe we should try." Alexei nodded. He didn't know what would happen next, but it was a start. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Forgiveness is a process that doesn't end in a moment. It lasts. And they realized that rebuilding a family would take time, patience, and effort on both sides. But now they knew that not all was lost. You can't always fix everything, but you can try. And it was this moment that was their first step toward a new beginning. And while they hadn't yet found all the answers to their questions, they realized that being there for each other was no small accomplishment. And though the road ahead remained difficult, they began it together with hope for the future.